what happens when these deployments run out and crime might possibly spike again in some of these cities? There is a bit of political risk there, I would see, perhaps for President Trump, for his administration, but it really depends on the messaging. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hi.
Good to see you again. It's so good to see each other. We all say it together.
I know, it's been a while.
Yeah, I've been away for a few weeks in Europe, and I came back to find the National Guard on the streets of Washington, D.C., or as President Trump likes to call it, an unsafe, dirty and disgusting city. So yeah, quite the change for me getting off the plane a couple of days ago.
Just a nice, quiet August here.
Yeah, it truly has been, hasn't it, Courtney? Not a lot going on. No, it's certainly jarring if you go to some of the spots in DC, and particularly I've noticed when I get on the metro, you see National Guard's troops on the platform sometimes, and it's a bit odd because in these rush hour times, the National Guard's troops almost seem really out of place, simply because it's obviously just a lot of people commuting and getting on the train. But it has changed the picture of DC certainly quite a bit.
Yeah, indeed. It's now we are also seeing members of the National Guard being armed on the streets, which was something at first they said they didn't plan to do, but Secretary Hegseth decided to arm them as well. So it's this weird juxtaposition of just workers, as you said, commuting, going about their lives, families going out for ice cream, and then you have these just random troops throughout the neighborhood. But, the president has said that he believes that his crackdown on crime, his so-called crackdown on crime is working, and he'd like to take it nationwide.
And we have to say the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, agrees with him. I mean, she held a press conference this week thanking President Trump for this move, which is controversial. And just to explain, I suppose, if people missed it in the last couple of weeks, this was about President Trump saying that DC was so crime-ridden and so awful. And he said, I have the quote here, "I'm rescuing DC from crime, bloodshed, bedlam and squalor." And he said it was embarrassing for him when he's going to meet world leaders and he has this city, the supposed great capital city of America. It's a picture he paints that I think those of us living here in Washington, D.C. would not necessarily see it in the same light. Yes, there is crime here as there is in any capital city. And there are areas of the city where crime is more prevalent than in other areas. And there are very serious social problems as well. Again, more concentrated in parts of the city than in others, as I think is probably the case in most capital cities. But the president has made it his sort of goal to clean up DC, beautify it, as he said. And as you're saying, Courtney, I mean, the mayor is thanking him for that and saying that the statistics are down and there has been a reduction in the number of gun assaults and homicides in the few weeks that there's been this surge of federal troops here in Washington.
Yeah, and I was looking at some numbers. Our colleagues at CBS News here had provided some statistics on this deployment of National Guard troops. I'm just looking at these. They actually really zoomed in on some of these numbers since President Trump brought the troops into Washington, D.C., and found that violent crime is down by almost half. I just want to preface this all by saying crime statistics well before this, National Guard deployment have always been somewhat sticky. No matter what the city, it's not particularly easy to tell what the driving causes are when there's, a flare-up of crime and when crime reduces again. And there was this big kind of standoff a few weeks ago when President Trump announced this deployment saying, well, Washington, D.C. has seen violent crime at a 30-year low. A lot of cities pointing to the fact that crime has been falling. But just to get back to these numbers that CBS had, they reviewed every crime incident reported to the police department here in D.C. between August 7th and 25th. And it showed that violent crime was down in comparison to the 5-year average for the same dates. Burglaries were down 48%, car thefts down 36%. And of course, it's always difficult to attribute crime, as I said, flare-ups or falls to a specific cause. But of course, these statistics, if you look at them, give the president and his administration cause, and the mayor as well, to say, look, it's working. I'm cleaning up Washington, D.C., and now it's time to move this on to other cities.
But she actually gave hard numbers for that as well this week. She said there had been 5 homicides or murders in Washington, D.C. in that period, 3 fewer than the same period last year. She said robberies had more than halved from 119 last year to 45 this year. And carjackings, which have been very prevalent in all parts of Washington, D.C. That is one of the kind of elements of crime that is, quite high in this city, have fallen from 31 for that period last year to just 4. So there are arguments about how the crime stats are taken and compared, but on the bold face of it, it would seem to be an improvement there.
I think, the carjacking statistic, I think she said it was an 87% reduction, really stood out to me because, as you guys recall, just a couple years ago, we had guidance being issued from the police telling us not to stop at lights and basically to drive in the middle of the road because these carjackings had become so prevalent. But again, as you mentioned, the crime before the National Guard came in was at a low and had been falling. I did find Mayor Bowser's remarks really interesting because she seemed to be against this deployment at first. And she had mentioned she spoke to the president this week. She didn't really divulge what exactly they spoke about or whether he planned to try and extend the deployment past the 30-day mark. But she seemed to get the memo that, what Donald Trump, the president, really wants is to be appreciated for this sort of law and order campaign that he's launched and that he campaigned on, during the election as well. But in the same breath, she also said this is not a long-term solution, right? She said that, that people are still living in fear. So, there doesn't seem to be any sort of resolution on where we go from here and whether they will remain as like a fixture in the city, or if this is just a short-term sort of campaign testing ground, let's say, for him to launch this elsewhere.
I think her fear piece as well was about not just those National Guard troops that, Sumi was describing there in the train stations and around some of the big populated areas like DuPont Circle or the Mall. But there's been a surge in other federal agents as well here, hasn't there? Particularly ICE, immigration, the immigration agents. And I don't know about you guys, but my WhatsApp chats and kind of community notice board, online groups and so on are full of videos of ICE agents making arrests, pulling people out of cars, off motorbikes, traffic stops, all kinds of stuff like this, and of course, with much of this material, it's hard to know whether these things happened, when they happened, what city they actually happened in. But, if even some of it is true and accurate, that's what's leading to a lot of that fear that people don't like seeing that heavier police presence. And it has been targeted in certain areas in this city as well, because, there is a different lifestyle in different parts of this city. There are incredibly wealthy people and there are incredibly poor people. Their station in life is so very different. Their opportunities are so very different. Their education is so very different. And there is a sense that certain communities are being extra penalized by the presence of some of these extra agents in the city.
Yeah, and I think, it really highlights the fact that some of our listeners have been to Washington and will know this, but Washington is a deeply liberal city. It is a progressive city. I also had messages in various neighborhood groups about what people were calling or neighbors were calling resistance to the federalization of the police department and to the deployment of troops. But really the fear was and the concern was around ICE arrests and how that would target some of the heavier Latino population neighborhoods that Washington, D.C. does have. And, the other thing to keep in mind is with National Guard troops, when you see them walking around Washington, D.C., they're easily recognizable, obviously, with their National Guard uniform. And now, as Courtney said, with service weapons. But one of the big criticisms of these ICE agents has been that they are masked, that they don't necessarily identify themselves, that they're, coming out of cars or perhaps waiting around corners. And that has added this real kind of this element of not only fear, but confrontation that could lead to something. That's been the big concern about the National Guard troops as well, is that if there is a spark, if there is, an altercation, are we going to see members of the National Guard using their service weapons against civilians in the streets of Washington, D.C.? And it's just a reminder of, yes, these crime numbers might tell the story of crime coming down in D.C., but residents here will say, many of them at least, that the risk is really great.
Yeah. And I think that, again, this comes back to, whether or not this is a long-term solution, right? Or is this a quick political fix that allows him to say, declare victory in that, these crime numbers are down, while also, as you said, carrying out these sort of mass arrests through ICE, which they've been a bit more opaque about in terms of the number of apprehensions they've made, who's making the actual apprehensions, and identifying some of these forces that we've seen throughout the city. And I think that fear carries over in some of these other cities he's eyeing, like Baltimore, like Chicago, where they do have, these huge immigrant communities. These are cities that are, of course, led by Democrats. And, there's a real fear of what this looks like in another city, particularly because he doesn't have the same sort of federal authority that he does here in DC.
And just to explain that, I suppose, for people who may not be familiar with that DC has a thing called Home Rule, which basically its budget and everything is controlled by Congress, but there is a commission here. But it isn't a standalone state like the other 50 states with its own governance and so on, and governor, indeed. It can elect a mayor and some council members, but they have very, very limited powers. So that's what has enabled President Trump to do this. But there is even a limit on that. I mean, I think he can only do it for 30 days and then Congress would have to vote to extend it. So, I mean, we're already, 3 weeks into it? So we're almost hitting that 30-day mark. But we did see him send the National Guard and indeed active service military into LA, didn't we? There is precedent there for him, or indeed for any president, to deploy troops where they see fit and where they see that the local state legislature is not controlling a certain issue well and needs the intervention of federal forces.
And you're seeing President Trump and his administration really leaning into this, talking about further cities where they can send National Guards troops and talk about fighting crime. And, I was seeing different Democrats say, oh, this is the distraction from some of the poor economic numbers or distraction from the Epstein files. But at the same time, the Trump administration is aware of the fact that fighting crime and law and order messaging does really work, not just among his base, but among a broader swath of voters. And I saw there was this recent poll done by AP and NORC on how people feel about this move in Washington, D.C. And I found it fascinating. 53% of Americans say they approve of how Donald Trump is handling crime. That's actually higher than his overall job approval and approval on other issues, including immigration. And 2/3 of the public think crime in the U.S. is a major problem. 81% thinks it's a major concern in cities. I would say that, the caveat there is I would be very curious to know if that 81% actually, if they live in cities. There's always this perception of people who don't live in cities who think crime in cities is awful. And for the people like us who live in a city like Washington, D.C. or Chicago, where I've lived previously, and I know you're from, Courtney, yes, crime is certainly an issue, but not the issue that people who live outside of these cities necessarily think it is. But, I mean, again, all of that to say, they see this as a winning issue and one where people support the numbers that we mentioned we're witnessing here in Washington.
It's so funny. I was at a family wedding in Northwoods, Wisconsin, which is very northern Wisconsin, over the weekend. And I was talking to another guest and she had asked where I lived. And I said, Washington, D.C. And she was from a small town in North Carolina. And she said, oh, I would love to go to Washington, D.C., but I couldn't drive there. And I sort of paused, and she continued and said, I would have to fly. And then even then I'd have to be picked up, right? Because it's so unsafe. And I just sort of looked at her and said, no, it's, you could drive. You could absolutely drive, and you could drive and get a taxi if you decided to fly. And she said, well, we must be getting different information. So it is all about perception. And, I do agree with you. I think, I saw a Democratic strategist saying the president is very good at understanding the power of emotion over fact when it comes to politics. And I think that's spot on. I mean, if people don't feel safe, then they don't feel safe. They're not going to look at the statistics and say, well, crime says it's down here, but I don't feel safe walking my dog at night.
And I think it makes it so difficult for Democrats, as you were mentioning there, Courtney, how to react to that. I mean, in the initial days and hours after the president deployed these troops to Washington, D.C., there was a big uprising from Democrats about, oh, this is awful and the city's not that bad and, we don't need them, it's our lovely city and so on. And then it kind of was like, well, are you pro-crime then? If you're not anti-crime, does that make you pro-crime? And then that's a very difficult message for the Democrats, particularly given their history and the last couple of decades, So it's again, I mean, we've spoken about it so many times, haven't we, about Donald Trump and kind of being the master of the message, which he is here again on this occasion. It has moved a lot of the focus of the chattering classes in this town away from Jeffrey Epstein and onto this notion, and then by spreading it to the possible question mark over Chicago and Baltimore kind of extends that as well. He's definitely taken the focus off something that was unpleasant for him and put it onto something that people will identify with. And he's also been talking about, once I deal with crime in DC, I'll deal with the rat infestation in DC. And I think that would be broad
welcome.
Support.
I am totally okay with that. Please.
Watch out, rat population.
Well, he might as well take on Chicago and New York when it comes to the rat population as well. Two very ratty cities, if I may say so. But I was speaking to a Democrat strategist earlier this week who was also saying this is a real trap for Democrats, to both of your points there, because, they do really need to carefully fine tune how they respond to Donald Trump here. And I'm curious to think what you guys think of the responses we have seen. On the one hand, the mayor, who is aware of the unique position that Washington, D.C. is in and has been very careful with their messaging from Donald Trump ever since the inauguration. She's met with him and she's tried to establish a relationship with him, but also aware of the fact that she has a liberal city that she's the mayor of that doesn't want this deployment, versus what we've seen from Gavin Newsom, this kind of, massive trolling that his press office has conducted, and that is, by some accounts for Democrats, really whipped up support for him and for his approach. Or J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, another possible 2028 presidential candidate like Gavin Newsom is, who's who basically stood on the water in Chicago, which is one of the most beautiful parts of Chicago, really showing off with images how lovely a city is. That doesn't mean there's not very serious crime there, but regardless, the imagery there was important to have the entire kind of city and state leadership on the Democrat side behind him. And he said, "We don't want you here, Mr. President." And I do wonder which of those messages, which of course all are carefully calibrated, will really work.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Gavin Newsom has gone all in on being, fighting fire with fire, as he says, right? And you have J.B. Pritzker, who is taking a different sort of stand. And I think we do well to remember that J.B. Pritzker made national headlines during the first Trump administration for his response to the COVID pandemic and his state response to, the federal management of the COVID pandemic. And again, as you said, a guy who has his eye on 2028, but then you also have this mayor who, has an activist background. And I would be remiss not to point out that, politics aside here, Chicago has a pretty traumatic history when it comes to militarized police. That city has, already done that, right? They did that in the 60s after the assassination of Martin Luther King and the Democratic National Convention, but then the 70s and 80s. So this is a city where there's going to be huge resistance to that sort of over-policing.
I mean, it's the bigger issue as well, isn't it, of the need for social interventions. I mean, crime just doesn't happen because people are just bad people and do bad things. I mean, of course, there are some tiny percentage who are like that, but mostly it's because of the social environment that you're in, the lack of opportunities, the lack of food, of housing, of education, of meaningful employment, of prospects to inspire you. And it's, we've seen it with many of the policies of this administration that they're kind of getting rid of some of those things that are the bedrock of society and getting rid of some of those policies and awareness campaigns and education campaigns and so on. And then you come in with the kind of more heavy-handed police side of things without actually addressing the issues that are there. So, if there's a short-term fix and then the agents move on, the social problems remain.
That was going to be kind of my question, for the Trump administration, rather. What happens when these deployments run out and crime might possibly spike again in some of these cities? Is that then something that President Trump tries to get ahead of by extending it by some sort of emergency decree? Again, all of this is fairly new territory. Or, are we talking about another piece of news at the time where we no longer are really focusing on the fact that a deployment ends in D.C., in Chicago, if it ends up happening, and the fact that maybe crime and some of the issues we've been discussing go back to the levels they were at, we're not focusing on that anymore. So, there is a bit of political risk there, I would see, perhaps for President Trump, for his administration, but it really depends, again, master the message, as you said, Katrina, on the messaging.
As we've learned, he's very good at changing the message. So, are we going to be back here, as you said, and talking about the statistics and how were the deployments meaningful? And then does he move the story on to something else?
It feels like Washington, D.C. for him is a very special case. There's all of what we've been talking about, but there's kind of taking over of Union Station, the big train station here. They announced during the week that this administration was shelving the $20 billion investment for expansion at Union Station. Some of the preparation work, which is already underway. They've started building a new bridge to link up various train stations or train lines within the station. And it kind of feels like he nearly sees himself as mayor of DC, that this is his town. His house is there in the middle of it. And, he wants it all to be to his liking, even to the way that he's constructing the ballroom and has paved over the rose garden. We saw images of that in the last couple of weeks, haven't we, of like the rose garden, the grass is gone and it's patio stones down and patio furniture and umbrellas and everything, making it look more like a club and the type of environment that he prefers himself to have, and all the gold leaf in the White House as well.
Yeah, Jackie Kennedy's rolling in her grave somewhere. But I also, just to jump in, I would say that is, a lot of this is the lead up to next year's 250th anniversary and his big production that he plans to put on, right? And he constantly references it in talking about how he's going to beautify the city, he's going to clean up the crime, he's going to get rid of the rats, right? He wants to put on this massive, production. He when the time comes and that we're going to have this big rollout of events to celebrate America's anniversary, right? And also when foreign leaders are coming in, he mentions how he finds it embarrassing that they are seeing parts of DC that aren't necessarily completely manicured and polished, and they're seeing instead homeless encampments. That is what really sort of was at the heart of a lot of this, right?
Yeah. Well, that could be an entire episode in itself, the preparations for the 250th birthday, but not for some time. But I think we've run out of time, guys. It's been great to talk to you both again.
Okay, well, we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
And you can catch up with all the episodes of The President's Path on BBC iPlayer if you're in the UK.
Or on YouTube if you're anywhere else in the world.
And if you want to get in touch, you can email us at path at bbc.co.uk.